LBJ championed civil rights legislation and fought poverty, while his government committed war crimes and spied on political rivals. He's also in the running for rudest president of all time, despite some stiff competition. Just like Richard Nixon, Lyndon B. Johnson decided to get an edge on his political opponent in the election of 1964 by using wiretaps to spy on the opposition. Unlike Nixon, he got away with it. After becoming president following John F. Kennedy's assassination, Johnson had Secret Service agents at his disposal and he used them illegally. Over the years, multiple people have confessed to helping Johnson win the election via illegal means, including the former director of the CIA. We now know that the CIA planted an agent within Republican Barry Goldwater's team, and the FBI listened to his conversations via wiretaps. Even Goldwater's plane was bugged. In all likelihood, Johnson was bound to win anyway, but spying gave him an edge. For one, Johnson was able to read Goldwater's speeches before he could deliver them. Goldwater later told the Washington Post that he knew he had no chance against Johnson and was well aware of the spying. It was once written off as paranoia, but it turned out to be true. Yet despite all this, it's Watergate, not Goldwatergate, that you remember. And in the end, Johnson won by a landslide. Brazilian President Zéu Goulart was a leftist with close ties to labor unions. Although he was not particularly radical, the U.S. was highly suspicious of the left-leaning politician who took power at the height of the Cold War. Plans to get rid of Goulart were formulated by John F. Kennedy's advisors in the early 60s, and Lyndon B. Johnson put them in motion when he became president in 1963. The fact that Goulart had been democratically elected by his own people was immaterial to the Johnson administration, who backed a military takeover in March 1964. In April, Operation Brother Sam sent U.S. forces as support, and weapons were delivered via an unmarked submarine to disguise U.S. involvement. Johnson's role in the coup was at one time just a mere suspicion, but declassified documents and audio tapes released since the 1960s have shown he was totally on board with the clandestine operation. He recommended that the U.S. do whatever was necessary to see it succeed. This included sending American ships to the coast and arming paramilitary groups in the area. Although many involved in the coup hoped an election would follow the upheaval, in reality, 21 years of brutal military rule was to follow. The consequences of the regime change were horrific for the Brazilian people, culminating in the so-called Years of Lead, during which many Brazilians were tortured or shot. In 1964, Johnson massively escalated the scale of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, despite strong opposition from his friends, advisors, and even the vice president. Opponents of the war correctly foresaw that the U.S. military would be trapped in an endless conflict that achieved very little and required too many bodies to sustain.
Nobody wanted that war less than Lyndon Johnson. Both of his sons-in-laws served in that war.
The number of American soldiers in Vietnam rose to 500,000. As troop numbers increased, so did unrest at home. Anti-war protests culminated in massive rallies such as the one conducted outside the Pentagon in 1967, which attracted 35,000 demonstrators. In the long run, anger over Vietnam did help kill LBJ's popularity, despite all the good that he did elsewhere. It didn't help that he repeatedly lied to the American public about the progress of the war. In fact, Johnson's infamous credibility gap over Vietnam became legendary.
I was of draft age during the Vietnam War, so for me, Lyndon Johnson was the devil.
The U.S. stayed in Vietnam until 1973, when they pulled out under the Nixon administration. Over 58,000 Americans died, along with millions of Vietnamese people. Countless others were psychologically scarred for life, and in the end, it was all for nothing. LBJ's communist containment policy was a failure. The war is a black mark against his legacy even today. Vietnam was not just a military blunder, it was a humanitarian catastrophe. American soldiers used Agent Orange and napalm against civilians, resulting in agonizing deaths and horrific injuries. In 1965, President Johnson ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, an attempt to bomb the Viet Cong out of existence.
The U.S. is now attacking the enemy's homeland, which President Johnson says is justified.
While these methods devastated the country, they didn't win the war. The U.S. couldn't defeat the guerrilla tactics of the North Vietnamese. In 1967, an international tribunal found the U.S. guilty of war crimes in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They had evidence that the U.S. had bombed civilian targets, used torture, and employed sadistic weaponry.
The people over there aren't really being treated as human beings. They're being treated as slaves.
In 1968, less than 1 year later, the My Lai massacre occurred. Around 500 civilians were tortured and killed, including small children. The incident was covered up for a year, and only one soldier was brought to justice. This extreme brutality swayed hearts and minds against the conflict and against Johnson himself. One of the worst U.S. interventions Johnson was involved in led to a full-blown massacre in Indonesia. In 1965, the Indonesian military, backed by extremist Islamic groups, carried out a coup, then massacred Indonesian communists. Those involved were taught that killing a communist was no worse than killing a chicken, and as many as 200,000 to 800,000 communist and communist sympathizers were murdered. Later, the regime targeted anybody and everybody, including foreign students. Today, we know that Johnson's administration backed the anti-communist armed forces. Before the takeover began, U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green offered to supply the Indonesian military with, quote, anything from covert operations and assistance to transport, money, communications equipment, or arms. The extent of U.S. involvement is not yet fully known, but the files that have been declassified indicate that Johnson's government provided money, radios, and a list of potential communist sympathizers.
It was very well understood at the time by U.S. foreign policy officials that Indonesia was far more important than Vietnam.
The regime that replaced communist dictator Sukarno was firmly pro-Western, and that was all that mattered. American communications from the era show that U.S. personnel documented the massacre with cold indifference. The regime change was even referred to as a fantastic switch in one U.S. cable. Johnson sent 22,000 troops to the Dominican Republic in 1965, despite being told that military intervention was a bad idea. Almost 2,500 Dominicans were killed during the occupation, which lasted for 14 months. U.S. interference resulted in an American-backed candidate who turned out to be incompetent and corrupt, but he ensured that Dominican resources wound up in American pockets. Worse still, Johnson lied about it. He told the public that over 1,000 Americans had been killed in the country, a claim that turned out to be a total lie. In reality, he was more worried about a possible pro-communist regime change. Experts now doubt there was ever any likelihood of a communist takeover, and that the intelligence Johnson relied on was dubious.
The United States government has been informed by military authorities in the Dominican Republic that American lives are in danger.
Johnson actually expressed regret about the invasion at the time. On a declassified recording from 1965, he can be heard saying, "Now, I don't always know what's right. Sometimes I take other people's judgments and I get misled, like sending troops in there to Santo Domingo." While President Johnson did a lot for civil rights, his tenure was marred by constant rioting fueled by rising racial tensions. Terrible conditions in America's cities, poor policing, and racial discrimination caused an explosion of violence unmatched in America's modern history. One of the worst incidents occurred in 1965 in Los Angeles. The so-called Watts riot was caused by tensions between the black community and police and resulted in 34 deaths. The government was slow to acknowledge the true cause of the violence, and the government's McCone Commission dismissed the riot as the work of thugs. Riots broke out again in 1967, with one of the worst occurring in Newark after two white police officers badly beat a black cab driver for a traffic violation.
Let us close the springs of racial poison. Let us pray for wise and understanding hearts.
In 1968, Johnson ordered a second inquiry into the causes of the riots. The resulting Kerner Commission investigation identified poverty, mass unemployment, slum housing, and racist policing as some of the key culprits behind the countrywide disturbances. Unfortunately, although Johnson conceded that poverty was a key driver behind the unrest, he ultimately bowed to white backlash against the Kerner report. He didn't divert funds to improve inner cities, and instead of tackling racist policing, he empowered the police. Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act in 1968, awarding police departments additional resources. LBJ was president during one of the worst flashpoints of the Cold War, and he even considered hitting the big red button. In 1968, a spy ship, the USS Pueblo, was attacked by North Korean forces and the crew was kidnapped.
I think most of us felt that we would probably be executed.
Granted, the ship was taking a big risk by spying in the area at a time when tensions between North and South Korea were particularly fraught. The North Korean Navy was on red alerts when they picked up the American vessel, and they took drastic action, interrogating and torturing the crew. Unsure what to do next, the Pentagon drew up a series of plans, including a naval blockade and an airstrike. One of the most terrifying options was Operation Freedom Drop, a plan to nuke North Korea to prevent an invasion of the South. Fortunately, Johnson opted for diplomacy. In the end, the wife of a State Department official suggested that the U.S. simply apologize for spying, then retract their apology later. To everyone's surprise, this simple diplomatic solution actually worked. The captured crew members were released, and no nukes were dropped. While the war in Vietnam raged, President Johnson's administration began a devastating bombing campaign against Laos and Cambodia. The bombing began in 1964 and continued after Johnson left office, lasting for 9 years in total. The cluster bombs used were gruesome, designed to send white-hot shrapnel in all directions when they exploded. This was Johnson's secret war, and it was only revealed to the public at a congressional hearing in 1971. The objective was to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a key supply line for the Viet Cong, and to support the Royal Lao government against local communists. As in Vietnam, the bombing achieved nothing but misery. It communists took power in 1975. Because Johnson conducted this war in the shadows, few Americans today are aware of the scale of the atrocities committed in Laos.
During that 9-year period, a plane load of bombs were dropped every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years.
An estimated 270 million bombs were dropped on the tiny Asian nation, which is still dealing with the aftermath today. Bombs flattened most of the country and have made the land dangerous to work even now. Roughly 1/3 of the bombs didn't detonate when dropped, and they still kill hundreds of unsuspecting civilians every year. President Johnson was a difficult person to be around. He terrorized both journalists and White House staffers.
He was a big man, but he could handle 2 fifths of cutting sark every night, and that's not good.
While he was known for being vulgar, tapes of Johnson's White House conversations have recently revealed the extent of his crude ways. Johnson swore a lot. He frequently used the N-word, despite his reputation as a civil rights hero. On one occasion, while talking about the election, he was heard saying, "I think I can take every Mexican in the state and every in the state." Some of his speeches and memos were later doctored to remove swearing and racial slurs.
Although we've had some thrilling successes and high moments of pride, there were some chilly moments too.
And his vulgarity went beyond bad language. Johnson peed in front of reporters and gave briefings from the toilet. He was handsy with women, cheated on his wife, and when he was angry, he became a screaming bully. He was strangely fixated on his own penis, which he proudly named Jumbo. After relieving himself, Johnson regularly left his Johnson dangling out of his trousers, loudly crowing about its great size.
How could anybody not like him?
And on top of it all, he created a scandal in 1964 when he lifted his dog up by its ears despite the obvious cruelty. When a public outcry ensued, he simply did it again to prove it did no harm. Today, Johnson's legacy is mixed. He was a hero to some, a villain to others, and a jerk to anyone who actually met him.